This is a question for Duncan Campbell. I know you were suggesting that there is a lot of structural unemployment in the U.S. and that may not be subject to aggregate demand pressures. But I wonder if the historical evidence supports that kind of argument. Oftentimes, when we're in a period of high unemployment, it appears that there's a lot of structural unemployment. But if you look at periods when there's been sustained aggregate demand pressure, positive aggregate demand pressure, there are groups who appear to be unemployable or less likely to be employed that you find actually do get jobs. So I just don't know what the evidence is, really, that we're in a structural unemployment trap as opposed to an aggregate demand trap in the United States at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. There's a question back there.
Thank you very much for these talks. I have a question to Mr. Möller. You pointed out the severe amount of low-wage contracts in Germany. I wonder, to your opinion, how that would change with a minimum wage of €8.50, which is likely to come, and also what would be the effect on employment in total?
Just at the back, just behind.
I have a question to Joachim Möller too. Unemployment has developed considerably well till 2005. The question is, where do we attribute it to? You have talked about low-paid jobs. Can you give numbers? How much comes from pushing people into low-paid jobs? And the other question, the other part of that attribution is, we also exported excess goods to other European countries, and this is in a kind of exporting unemployment, these trade imbalances. Do you have any measure how much of this improvement may come from there? Thank you.
Just one row back.
Thank you. I would make a short comment on what Krugman called the German miracle. Of course, Professor Möller was right in saying that all the provision made within Germany were helpful. They were necessary one, but from my point of view, not sufficient one. The important difference compared to other countries was that the German downturn was demand-led, and to be precise, export demand-led. We had a break in exports by 15% in 2009. But the positive element was that German enterprises were expecting that this export will recover very, very quickly. And they were right in this expectation because German exports were to countries which were not so much affected by the crisis like emerging countries and China. And because of this forecast they made, they were able and they were prepared to hoard labor. And without this expectation, I can't see that all these provisions made would be such successful as they were. Thank you.
And one final question in the front.
Robin Pope, thank you very much. I have one question for Dean Baker. I really liked the focus on patents and copyrights, and I wondered if in terms of driving inequality, one index to look at is that they must have multiplied many-fold. Already US had 15 times the amount of GDP on lawyers that Germany had, and you can treat that as a waste like most of the excess in finance. And with the changes in the patent laws since 1980, that this will have raised that. And then I also had a question for Joachim Möller on the head of the Peterson International Institute produced some statistics showing that both the number put into apprenticeships and the amount that Germany is spending on universities, two methods of keeping inequality down somewhat, had declined in recent years. And I personally know many people with university degrees who actually, because it's not policed, they're taking lots of 400 euro a month jobs and not getting further training as well as others. And I wondered if you would comment on, and others tell me that delinquency at school is not being policed as it used to be, whether you would comment on these measures, if this is impressionistic on top of his statistics, that these sorts of things are eroding the German model.
Thank you. Maybe one more
Perhaps
question.
two further shades of grey on Mr. Möller's sunny side. First thing, I think you presented the German unemployment data, and what puzzles me here is that we had a constant gap to the ILO data of about 1.5 and 2 percentage points in the earlier years, which in the meantime is closed, more or less closed. So my first suspicion would be that 2 percentage points of the reduction in unemployment in Germany goes down to creative statistics and not so much to more employment. Second point, same question, but together with an answer. If you move from a current account deficit to a current account surplus of about 7%, 7 percentage points of GDP, and then you can apply the multiplier for closed economy, then you would say, well, because you talk about the current account balance and not just about exports, then you would say, well, GDP should go up by about 15 percentage points, which would mean if the higher employment in Germany with the effect of labor market reform, our employment should be higher by 15%, not by just a few percentage points. So the overall consequence of the Hartz reforms and OZ was higher unemployment. It just didn't happen here.
Okay. There was one more question. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm Marc Lavoie from the University of Ottawa. The question maybe for the last two speakers. I was wondering if the German employment miracle was caused by the same factors as the Dutch employment miracle in the 1990s, meaning it was caused by a slowdown in labor productivity.
Okay, I think we'll go back to the podium now, and we'll have a second round of questions. So maybe we should go in order of speaking, if that's fine with you.
Okay, I didn't get many questions posed to me. I'm going to be imperialist, being U.S. Take a couple points. I'll take Jerry's question, because actually that is a very good question on structural unemployment, because I raised the same issue myself. I do think you do have a story where you have a lot of people out of work for a long period of time. Some of those people will remain permanently out of work. On the other hand, I mean, they might end up being unemployable, but on the other hand, I think, and I'm not blaming you for this, but there are certainly people in the United States who are quick to say the problem's structural. If we envision a case where, let's say, before the downturn, the U.S. could have gotten to 4% unemployment, then because of prolonged unemployment, we have more structural unemployment. Maybe we're talking 4.5, 5. I don't think there's any reason to believe we're anywhere close to what actually would be limits in terms of how low we could press unemployment with more demand. And the 90s are a great example here that, I don't think it's sufficiently acknowledged. There was near universal agreement within the mainstream of the profession that the NAIRU, meaning structural rate of unemployment, was somewhere in the neighborhood of 5.6 to 6.4%. We got down to 4% as a year-round average in 2000, and you will not find any evidence of an increase in core inflation. So in other words, they were completely wrong, and that was, very much a consensus. So, so yes, I do believe there's some people that, going 2 years, 3 years without work, they're never going to be able to work again. But no, we're not near those limits. The other question directed me with patents, yes, incredible waste, as mentioned in drugs. The other sector where this comes up and employs a lot of lawyers, I mean, many sectors, but the other that's been very visible is in the high-tech sector. Apple and Samsung compete at least as much in court as they do in product development. Google bought up a division of Motorola, their mobility division, and it was widely reported in the business press they were doing it for their patents. And it wasn't because they actually wanted to use the patents. The standard practice is that when you get sued, you counter by suing someone else for patent infringement. Google, being a relatively new company, didn't have the same sort of backlog of patents that, you know, say a Samsung or Apple would. That's why they bought them up. This is incredible waste.
All right. Okay. Well, he said it. Yeah, I agree with everything Dean said. First of all, just the source of my data were not U.S. specific. They're coming from an IMF staff paper, the authors of which I've forgotten, you know, but I can get it to you if you haven't seen it already, Jerry. As well as the World of Work report, which we put out at the ILO, which uses aggregate OECD level data. And what both papers find is that on average over countries, we see a rightward shift of the beverage curve, and that's what led to my statement. My own suspicion is that for the United States, first of all, and please disagree with me, but I don't think we've seen long-term unemployment rates of this magnitude in a very long time indeed. I fully suspect that people who want a job in the United States can be reabsorbed at a lower wage rate, maybe a different profession, maybe a different this or that, than they could more easily, for example, in Europe. Yeah? And so that, I think, probably might happen. I furthermore believe in two other things. One is the empirical point that what happens in a recession is that increases in IT go up for corporations. You know, there's a labor hoarding phenomenon, as Dr. Möller told us earlier, but then when the labor hoarding stops and companies get rid of people, they invest in IT. And so these people aren't coming back, right, to their former jobs. And I think there's pretty, it's not my evidence, but I think there's pretty solid evidence on this. And finally, there's a work from a colleague of mine at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, named Peter Capelli, who is writing about, you know, if you go to the World Economic Forum, you know, or something like that, some employers' jamboree, you will find out that businesses are complaining of labor shortages. They can't find the right skills and all that, you know, all that sort of thing. And basically what Capelli is saying is nonsense. It's a buyer's market. And you want a ready-made, off-the-shelf product sitting at the desk at 9 a.m., and if you can't get it, then there's a labor shortage.
Okay. So a lot of questions, and I'm in a comfortable situation to pick out those who are the easiest to answer. First, with the creative statistics, I think that's really not true. If you're going to the website of the Federal Labor Agency, the statistics, you'll see the concept of underemployment. And the concept of underemployment includes all the people that are not counted as unemployed, but actually are unemployed. And if you plot this figure of underemployment against the figure of the registered unemployment, you see that these figures are moving in parallel. So in 2005, we had underemployment of something like 7 million, yeah? And it's now down to 4 million. So it's 1 million more than, say, the official figures. That's true, but the change, it's important is a change over time. And this is not manipulated by statistics. By the way, as our institute always criticizes any attempts to manipulate the unemployment statistics. And I had a really struggle with one of the former Ministry of Labor with that respect, I can tell you, but cannot go into details. But this is, of course, clear. The unemployment figure itself is object to political manipulation. That can be, but in the German case, the figures are, in my view, rather realistic. So the next point was the question related to the current discussion on the minimum wage in Germany, and the question was €8.50. Is that a level that is reasonable? I think nobody knows ex ante. If it's implemented, then you have, as an empirical economist, you can look at the data and you can apply methods to find out what happened. We did that for the minimum wage in the different sectors of the economy. For example, the construction sector. I did it myself as a PhD student, and what we found out was that, of course, the level of the minimum wage matters a lot. If it's too low, then nothing happens. It's not binding. If it's too high, every economist would agree, then it costs jobs. But there's something in between that could be interesting. A neoclassical economist would never say that there is something in between. A minimum wage job always costs jobs, full stop. But I'm convinced that given the structure of the labor market, given the imperfection in the labor market, there is some room for a minimum wage that it's not detrimental to employment. And the big question is, where's the red line? If you go beyond, then the job destruction starts. And in the empirical study we did on the construction sector, the minimum wage in the western part of the country was 60% of the median wage. In the eastern part of the country, it was 80% of the median wage. And we found that some indications that there were negative effects, not too strong, but there were negative effects in the east. But no negative effects in the west, even though still some variance of the estimates that there might be even some positive effects of a minimum wage. One can explain that. For example, vacancy will be filled much more easily if the earnings are higher, and this might help to fill the jobs. Another point?
Sure.
The question on, of course, it's true that the German recovery was export-driven, and the demand from outside the country created a lot of jobs within the country. And we know that we have a big problem within the country. There's insufficient investments in public, in infrastructure, for example, but also in private sector. And this is also related to the low productivity. It was another question we have in the country. So I would not stress the sunny side of the story. There are some really critical points that should be addressed in the close future.
Okay, so we have now time for second round. There was Jan, Özlem, and then Tom.
I have two little additions and questions to Joachim Möller. The picture, the sunny side of the picture for Germany is not as sunny as you say, and you missed when you described the German so-called miracle, I would say at least 3 points. The first one is, you know the data better than me, but as far as I know, the aggregate number of working hours presently in the economy is as high as round about 1999, when Germany was called by the economists the sick man of Europe. So in this 14 or so years period, where is the miracle in terms of hours worked? So if there is a miracle, it must be a miracle of distributing working hours on more people. And if you would go into that, we would certainly agree that this is mini jobs, this is part-time jobs, this is not average working hour reduction for ordinary people. It was lengthened for a number of people. And much of this is on the bad side of your picture, and you're right in putting it on the bad side. So, therefore, there is no miracle in terms of labor, and labor is counted correctly in hours of work. And we are happy to have the statistics from your institution, and we have it not everywhere. So I would be, in that respect, more pessimistic. Secondly, the interpretation of the beverage curve needs more care. If you remember, you people remember the picture, what you could see was a clear move on the beverage curve to the right. So there is a lack of jobs relative to vacancies still. And that is the major part of unemployment. And there is a little bit of increase in the last few years to the outside, to the right or upward on the right side. So the major part of the story of that picture is there is a lack of jobs. And the smaller part of the story is there are more vacancies. And then we would have to interpret why are there more vacancies relative to jobs. And this takes a little bit of care to, there are many or several possible interpretations. It could be lack of upward flexibility of wages, because wage flexibility should be the normal way to bridge it. It could also be that simply the length of filling the vacancies is 1 month more, which seems to me quite natural for many jobs if we live in a knowledge economy or so. There are other possible opportunities to interpret it differently than simple mismatch or labor scarcity or whatever it is. Finally, what for my taste belongs to the picture of the German so-called miracle is the export of unemployment to the rest of Europe and some other parts in the world, with 6% or so surplus in the trade balance. So if you argue macroeconomically and go beyond the narrow labor market view, you have to take that into account, and then you see the picture is not so nice, and you see that Germany has, maybe it's not the sick man of Europe, because we have other much more sick men and women in Europe, but we have strong distortions in the German macroeconomy and in the structure of the German economy. This overstretched export orientation and the fall in the wage share and the functional income distribution, which you left out because you can't say everything in 20 minutes, but this is a key feature. And it also explains contributes to low growth in Germany. So your picture is quite narrow, and I'm sure you agree with what I have said. And then the not so nice sides of the story come more to the surface.
Excellent.
University of Greenwich. Let me take forward from where Jan has left, and it's a question also to Joachim Möller. Did you look at the effect of the low-wage service sector in Germany on the export sector? So many people hypothesize that the low-wage sector and the services made it feasible that there was a wage moderation in the relatively higher wage export sector as well. And that is one of the reasons of a falling wage share in Germany that has led to a deficiency of aggregate demand at a domestic level, out of which Germany tried to export its why. That, however, of course, can only coexist with a debt-led, consumption-led model in the rest of the world and in Europe. So, in that sense, as problematic as the debt-led model is, so is the export-led model of Germany. And that all ties back, in a way, to the low-wage sector, but it has further macro repercussions. The second question is, when you mentioned in your response your work on minimum wages, Are you including any positive rebound effects that can come from a minimum wage in terms of improving wages in general at the economy level that can generate further positive demand effects? And if employment is demand-led, hence in the aggregate level, you will have further effects of minimum wages that we usually miss if we look at it at a very micro level. Hence, the region of a decent minimum wage, you think, may be quite higher than it might be if you ignore the rebound effects. One question maybe to both Joachim and Duncan, and in a way, an invitation to Dean also to speak to that question, bringing his former work. When you were talking about this sort of risk of overregulation, is there any empirical support for that in terms of the impact of employment protection legislation or other labor market institutions on employment, really? Because the evidence that I know from Dean and his colleagues about the effects of labor market institutions using panel data on unemployment is really, there is no robust negative effect. In the opening plenary, Engelbert Stockhammer mentioned other things. Usually if you control for particularly demand effects, those institutional effects disappear or very few of them survive. So do we really have anything to say about this plateau and there is a overregulation risk, or is that a neat theory that you have to say when you're talking to your correspondent experts in the IMF and the likes?
I have a question for Duncan, Tom Pally. Now, Duncan, I know you're sort of more don't have to, this is more a comment initially and then the question. You occupy, you're in a political institution and you have to be political in your dealings with the IMF and the World Bank, and you have to make tactical and strategic decisions about how to engage them. But I would like to caution you a little bit about too much praise for the IMF, because it's a bit schizophrenic. One's hearing quite good things from head office, as it were, and then the country desks do pretty terrible things. And I urge you, actually, Dean's co-director colleague, Mark Weisbrot, has written quite a nice paper where they went through and looked at all the country-level recommendations coming out of the Article 4 reviews. Mm-hmm. And they really are quite retrograde still. Mark scored them, in terms of which way on how they're doing regarding the plateau, and they were wanting to kick countries off the plateau, as it were, on the wrong end. And so I guess that then leads to my question. I'm wondering if economists who get it wrong for 25 years should also be kicked off the plateau.
Job security. Exactly.
Thank you. A question, or maybe a shift of focus concerning Dean and Duncan, because you've been talking about specifically international rule of labor market institutions, and to me it is somehow surprisingly how someone, yes, you apologized for being Americans, and so we are apologizing all for being in the OECD countries, but especially with labor market, I think we should keep in mind that the main number of labor forces nowadays not any longer employed in the industrialized countries. And if we are looking back in just a few months, the entire history of the Arab Spring, of these revolutions around the Mediterranean Sea, well, one of the main reasons applied to it is the huge youth unemployment, the not sufficient possibilities of jobs in these countries. And where my questions comes in, what can we say about labor market institutions, to be implemented where, which is the recommendations we can give to developing countries, countries which have huge potential of young people coming up with sometimes even very good education, which are facing developing countries where we are not talking about a big capital stock, which are really in the phase of getting somewhere.
Okay, in the interest of a long day, third day, and then I'm taking 2 more questions, and then we're closing and coming back to the panel. So yes, please.
Yes, Johan Narsken, Maastricht University. All the 3 speakers have been talking about inequality and how bad it is, but I did not really hear what we should do about it. And I would like to invite them to say some suggestions. And Möller is suggesting intelligent regulation. I want to add 2 things to that, if you don't mind. One thing is that I think that regulation is not the only answer, but also the mindset and the social norms in society, because everybody is very clever in evading regulations. So if society doesn't have social norms to control this, it won't work. And in the Netherlands, as an example, you see that we now have a cap on salaries, or we are discussing and trying to impose caps on salaries of a large number of NGOs, executives, for instance. They are not allowed to earn more than the minister-president, the highest official in our country. And that creates a lot of discussion also in society, and that might work a little bit more. And you also see that bonuses of bankers are starting to being discussed, etc. So I think we should need that kind of things.
Thank you. And the last one at the back, please.
Jasper Sky. I wanted to know that the people at UMKC and elsewhere talk about an employer of last resort policy. They advocate the idea that the US government should become an employer of last resort. And here in Europe, we have a lot of people talking about guaranteed basic income. If you put these 2 ideas together, then you get a situation where the government might, a job center, for example, the Arbeitsamt in Germany, could become not just a broker of jobs, but also a dealer in jobs. And you might have a situation where people will be offered a basic income, but only if they work for it. So the idea of an employer of last resort, the question is to the whole panel, is this a crazy idea, an unworkable idea? Is it an idea that is wild and woolly? Or is it a possibly practical idea? And if it is, then how would you pay for it?
Okay, thank you. So I would suggest we now take this large set in the opposite direction.
Yeah. I would like to answer to your question, where you had the 3 points. The first one, I think I do not agree with the argument that the volume of labor, the working hours, is the aspect we should look at. If you consider working hours, mean working hours over the last century, it was declining in trend. And this is typically a quite normal thing, because leisure is a luxury good, so to speak. And if society becomes richer, then it's clear that the average working hour should go down. And so it's in my view, it's really something that's going on. That we have a new distribution of working hours. We have more jobs. It was demanded over decades that should be the case, and I think it happened. Of course, there are shady sides. I'm critical to mini jobs. It's a trap for many people, especially females, to expand their working hours. I know that there are a lot of females that would like to expand working hours. By the way, male workers, if you ask them, they typically want to reduce the number of working hours. But if you see from this background, I would say you cannot dispute that there were labor market progress, and there are sunny sides of the picture in my view. One should not look at total hours, but on employment, but of course see also the shady sides with precarious employment is not, of course, not what we would like to have. Second point, the beverage curve. I think I do not agree completely, but we should discuss that. That's a very technical point, but we should discuss it separately. By the way, in my picture of the beverage curve, there was an outward shift of the curve in 2005, which is simply explained by 500,000 of people that were not counted unemployed before, but they were considered, they were recipients of social assistance, And if they were considered to be available to the labor market, they were in 2005. They were from 2005 onwards. They were counted as unemployed. So this is a counterexample, by the way. That in some periods, political decision even counted more person as unemployed, and there was, I think, not a necessity to do so. Export of unemployment. Unfortunately, I did not show that, but I have a nice graph that shows that the unit labor cost in Germany and the export successes extremely correlate. So that it's really a point that we had very low wage increases over the last, or even reduction in the wages over the last 10 or 15 years. So it could be seen as a beggar my neighbor policy, and to some extent it is, I would say. But the consequences could not be that we should reduce our efforts to export goods. I think that's the strength of the German economy, and we should be happy with the strong exporting sector. And where we have these sectors, we have typically higher productivity, higher wages. I'm coming from Bavaria. I know where I'm speaking of, and my hometown Regensburg is really a boom town. 3% unemployment rate, or below 3%, high increase in wages. So that's, and it comes, of course, from the exporting industries. So we should not artificially reduce the sector. But I think there's, I find it quite plausibly what I think Gerd Wagner had an article in a newspaper, and the headline was, "We are living beyond below our possibilities." And I think that if one thinks about that, perhaps we should have more wage increases in the next year. And I think the indicators show that this will also be the case, because also of shortages of qualified people in some areas of the economy that will give support to higher wages. But we also perhaps should increase expenses, for example, with respect to infrastructure, etc. So there are a lot of things we should have in mind. One last point, a very short one. The service, low-wage service industries. I think that typically that has not very much to do with the success of the exporting industry. The low-wage sector in Germany are not the sectors that are internationally competing with other countries. They're typically personal services, cleaning, hotel, restaurants, etc. That is where really low wages are paid.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, thanks very much for these very easy questions that I'll address very briefly nonetheless. Is there any evidence for labor market regulation falling off the plateau on the rigidity side? We're dubious about that at the ILO. We don't have any evidence of that ourselves, really, in a very strong way. I personally feel that India might be, might have overdone it a little bit. I don't think it's because of the stringency of the regulation. I think it's because there are 150 laws that are applicable in labor in India. Does that explain why the economy is 93% informal? I don't think so. So what is the challenge here? The challenge here, let me be blunt, is the doing business report of the IFC, of the World Bank Group, which had an employing workers index that rewarded countries on the basis of having the fewest labor laws possible. We didn't like that. Okay, yeah, too much praise for the IMF, Thomas. Well, yeah, all right. Well, look I deal at headquarters level. But no, you're precisely right. It's also true of the World Bank, by the way. As you go down to decentralized level to the country offices of both these organizations, then you discover that they are not mouthing what Olivier Blanchard might mouth in Washington and things, and they're thinking completely differently. We're quite aware of that. We've done our own work on Article 4 reports, and we've discovered, quite frankly, that what the IMF recommends for Cameroon is identical to what it recommends for Cambodia. Okay? So yes, I take your point. What to recommend about youth employment, in the Arab Spring connection and things, oh goodness. That's just a huge thing. I've just begun to look into your EU stuff here, the youth guarantee. I'm not getting a lot of, positive vibes, about how that's working. Works in Austria, works in Finland, where else? So I'm not sure about that. Basically, we're talking, when we talk youth employment, we're talking, and this is related to another question here, we're talking apprenticeships, we're talking internships, we're talking putting people to work in whatever possible capacity for the reason that I gave in my presentation, which is that separation from the labor market is about the worst thing that can happen to anybody, and even more so for a young person. So we're thinking of all these sorts of things. We're thinking about it even for Greece, with its 64% youth unemployment rate. It's got to do something. That's not going to disappear. Youth unemployment can disappear, they just get older. But I mean, in the interim, there's something to do here. Okay, what to do about inequality? Well, I don't know, a lot of things. I gave the example of how Belgium and the United States are identical in their market-determined outcomes, and that after the fact, they're very different in their levels of inequality. We call that tax and transfer, right? Which is naughty words in the United States, where I'm from. But nevertheless, people do that sort of thing. Lord Richard Laird writes about this with authority, because very often, if you look at behavioral economics, you can't draw many policy conclusions. He certainly does. He's saying it's the tax system. If this notion of a relative utility function, right, and this hedonic treadmill issue are problems that impinge upon self-reported well-being, then let's deal with it through the tax system. Well, is David Cameron going to say, oh yeah, I agree? I don't think so. But nevertheless, I think it's a good idea. My final point is on the employer of last resort sort of thing. And the notion of a guaranteed basic income. I'm interested in both. The employer of last resort worked incredibly well in the 2008 crisis in many, many countries that devoted a lot of their fiscal stimulus to actually hiring people to do work in infrastructure and things like that. I'm totally in favor of that as being a principal role of the state. Right? I would never say no. Guaranteed basic income, guess what else worked? Something called the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in India, which is a rather large place, and it was rolled out to the entire population. Right? Are there problems? Are there leaks? Are there this? Are there, yeah, well, all sorts of things. Did it work as an automatic stabilizer? Yes, indeed. How much does it cost? Ooh, a fortune. Less than 1% of Indian GDP for the entire country. So I'm all in favor of thinking of guaranteed basic incomes and the employer's last resort. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. A lot of very good questions. First off, the aggregate work hours, I won't add too much to that, but I mean, to my mind, it's a great story that, if you could lower unemployment while you have the same number of work hours, I don't really see it as in itself for people to work. I mean, as an environmental principle, that's what we want. Now, there is obviously the issue of distribution, which is big. I'm not trivializing that, but I don't see an indictment that we haven't had, or Germany, I should say, hasn't had an increase in aggregate work hours. The point about vacancies, the Beveridge curve, there's actually some interesting research on that. Peter Diamond did a good lit review that I think's at Boston Fed, where there's some very interesting issues. So you get different vacancy rates for the same amount of jobs depending which industries have the listings. There are very big differences, and this was some of the literature we reviewed. So there's some interesting points there that do explain some of the increase. I'm not going to say all of it, but some of the increase. I wouldn't indict Germany for being a big exporter. I mean, that is kind of supposed to be the textbook story that rich countries are supposed to export. Now the problem has been that Germany's exporting a great deal to other wealthy countries. Prior to 1997, I'll join in the beat up of the IMF. Prior to 1997, the world was to at least some extent working the way the textbook's supposed to, with rich countries exporting capital to developing countries. That really reversed following the East Asian financial countries, I would argue, because of the nature of the bailout. After that point, all the developing world was beginning to accumulate massive amounts of reserves, and flows went the other way, and that persists to this day. So I don't particularly blame Germany for having an export surplus. I think the problem is who it's with. Couple other points, inequality, how do you deal with it? A lot of good proposals, but my best look, and again, it's a US-centric view, is beat the top down, get rid of the patent protection that makes a lot of people really rich, a financial transactions tax, great for reducing inequality. Our doctors heavily populate the 1%. They get twice as much as doctors in Germany. No excuse for that. I mean, we have all sorts of protectionist barriers. Corporate governance system, again, our system's a sham. Germany's is certainly much, much better. We could look to improve things that way. So my view, beat the top down. Employer of last resort, I'm sympathetic, and there are success stories. I just wrote a book with my friend Jared Bernstein on full employment. We went back and forth on this. I guess my main concern is simply a political one. If you have millions of people employed, it's going to be hard to supervise them. I'm thinking, again, a U.S. context. It's not going to be a politically saleable point. So my view is kind of step into it, show you could do it, show you could supervise it. There's not a lot of corruption. That would be great. Basic income, again, depends on the level, but, the principle is fine. The last point, negative effects of labor market regulation, excessive. I'm sure there are some, but I guess the analogy I would make is, people worrying about hyperinflation. You could have it, but the incidents are few and far between.
Thank you. So thanks a lot for a great discussion and inputs and discussion on this panel. I have a few announcements to make, and I promise there's information in there that's relevant for you. First of all, I would like to thank very much the organizing team, the excellent administrative organizing team doing a lot of hard work in the background, Susanne Stöger and Katharina Jacobi, as well as Til van Dregen and Andy Watts and Eslem Onaran for the hard work